This is our first workshop where we're calling it the Unconventional Measurement Workshop. I think you'll probably understand as we get towards the end of the presentation why we're calling it the Unconventional Measurement Workshop. But to give you an executive summary, we're going to challenge some of the preconceived ideas of how you might do marketing, and particularly how you might do digital marketing in relation to the measurement of that. I think there's probably a lot of bad practice that exists within the industry that's often quite oversimplified and often perhaps a little bit self-serving towards the people that benefit from digital media being spent. So primarily the media owners that are often involved in marking their own homework. So if that kind of works as a very high level introduction, I'm going to move on into the presentation because I've got a lot of things to say actually about this topic. So for today's agenda, we'll do a very brief introduction. I'm going to talk through some of the common pitfalls that are associated with digital and performance marketing measurement. We're then going to look at the effectiveness research overview because there's been a lot written about how marketing and advertising drives profit. I think that's very different to the kind of conventional wisdom that you hear associated with performance marketing. And I think kind of exploiting that tension, that difference is actually a very good space to be in. We'll then move into kind of talking about how we measure for incrementality, because I think that is the number one single most important thing you can do to overcome some of the problems I'll talk about today. And then finally, to close, if it's not too self-indulgent, we'll talk about some of the products and services that we've developed here at CVE, Control versus Expose, that help marketers navigate this world. So very briefly, just wanted to cover who I am and who CVE are for those that aren't familiar with myself or the company. So I'm Aidan Mark. I'm Global Director of Performance Strategy at CVE, that's Control versus Exposed. And my background is primarily in digital marketing. I've spent probably the first 15 or so years of my career in digital performance roles. So I've looked after things like programmatic, social, PPC and affiliate marketing, culminating in me being head of performance at Havas Media Group for many years. After that, I joined a creative agency called VCP, where I had an even grander job title. I was head of effectiveness. And more recently, I've joined CVE. Well, a big reason of that was actually to do with the name, Control versus Exposed. It kind of alludes to scientific measures, kind of scientific best practice. And I think probably our industry is sorely lacking in scientific rigor. And hopefully you'll see what I mean by that as we talk through the presentation today. A little bit briefly on CVE, Control versus Exposed. We're kind of a hybrid of a couple of different types of companies. On one hand, we do media activation and strategy services, so a bit like a media agency. We also have a technology and analytics arms that develops lots of different products, some of them around measurement. And finally, we also have kind of consultancy services, of which very much I'm a part of, and I lead all of the kind of measurement and what we call decision science elements of our consultancy services. So hopefully I'm reasonably well qualified to talk about the topics of here today. Let's start off with what I think a quote that probably exists in almost every presentation that has ever been written about marketing effectiveness. That quote comes from John Wannamaker, who was probably one of the founders of advertising. He wrote this about 100 years ago. And his famous quote is that half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is I don't know which half. And really what John Wannamaker meant by that is that kind of advertising overall works, but it's quite hard to understand which parts of the advertising mix, the media mix, are actually working. Of course, John Wannamaker comes from a world where he was buying, poster advertising and print advertising. So it's hard to be precise about, who's seeing those ads and ultimately who's responding. But yeah, he was the first person to kind of publicly go on record that saying, I think advertising is pretty effective. Fast forward about 100 years, and you've got the kind of advent of digital and performance marketing. And the kind of the view of whether advertising is working or not is fundamentally different to the John Wannamaker quote. The kind of modern view of advertising effectiveness is that, well, I've got a login, I've got a platform that allows me to see, often in real time, exactly what's going on with my digital campaigns. I can see who's clicking, who's responding, and sort of, John Wannamaker would probably think this was nirvana, whereby he could see exactly which parts of his media mix were working. My view, as you'll probably see today, is that I think probably the reality is somewhere in the middle of these two kind of polar opposite views. And I think it's kind of interesting that in the modern era, where digital was sold on this promise of being, heavily accountable, very measurable, very optimizable, that some big brands have made very public statements saying that they're over-investing in digital marketing. These quotes all come from the last 3 or 4 years. Adidas said that they'd over-invested in marketing with a over-focus on efficiency rather than effectiveness. Airbnb, in the middle of the pandemic, decided to slash a lot of their performance marketing spend and move the fund spend further up the funnel into brand building. And probably the most famous example comes from Procter & Gamble, who I think at the time were the biggest advertiser in the world. And they cut $200 million worth of global advertising spend across digital media. And the following year, they drove record profits. And so I think to myself, if these big, mature businesses who are spending a lot of money on highly measurable and accountable advertising have kind of publicly said that they've made some mistakes, it's probably something we should look at this in a little bit more detail and understand why they've made these mistakes and what we can do to overcome them. And one of the things I want you to think about today is probably this notion about digital being a highly measurable medium. If you remember back to the kind of early days of digital, I certainly do, and digital always promised it's the most measurable form of advertising that ever existed. And that's sort of true, but I think probably the more nuanced and perhaps more accurate statement is that, well, digital media is the most measured form of advertising. It's not necessarily the most measurable. And the reason that it's like that is because ultimately we're trying to understand human behavior. You know, there's 7 billion, maybe 8 billion people out there in the world who are all kind of making lots of different purchase decisions each and every day. And we sit in marketing boardrooms trying to work out, well, why have people bought this or why have people not bought that? We need to accept, I think it's fundamentally quite a difficult task to do at scale. And actually, probably some of the pitfalls that the likes of Airbnb and Adidas have fallen into by working on the assumption that this is easy. This is not easy, that's all. So what did change with digital? Because I'm pretty sure it did change something. And if it's not the fact that it's all measurable now, what is the thing that changed? I would argue that the thing that changed with digital is that how targeted media is. And that's the thing that really changes kind of the media landscape from the John Wannamaker era. When John Wannamaker was putting posters out there into the world and press advertising, they were going to everyone that was seeing that. They were basically untargeted or very minimal levels of targeting. In the digital media age, everything is hyper targeted, and it's getting ever more targeted through time. To kind of illustrate this point, I was fascinated by some research that came out from Facebook 6 years ago. And actually, stuff moved along in 6 years. But the research from Facebook 6 years ago said that after 300 likes, Facebook knows you better than your spouse, which is quite a statement. Wow, like, what do they mean by that? What they meant by that is that Facebook, after 300 likes, could predict your voting behavior more accurately than your wife or your husband. That's pretty powerful stuff. And obviously, Facebook is designed to be an ad platform. It's designed to help marketers. It's not strictly designed to help people kind of understand which way you're going to vote, although, there have been some scandals on that front. But if Facebook can predict how well we're going to vote after 300 likes, imagine how well they can predict our shopping behavior. Imagine how well other brands like Google, who see kind of what we're actually searching for, when we're looking to buy things, how accurate their view might be. This is the thing that's changed, the ability to hyper-target with absolute accuracy around, people's shopping habits. And unsurprisingly, global data is growing exponentially. Probably the rate of change suggests that every 3 or 4 years, we get about double the amount of data that exists in the global, what they call data sphere. It's a mind-bogglingly huge amount of data, more than basically any human can kind of get their head around. And to kind of illustrate that point, the fact I was talking about from Facebook when they said that they could predict your voting habits better than your spouse, that came sort of 6 years ago. And actually, the amount of data in that time has more than doubled. So they're even better than they were then. And the brands that hold the most data are Google and Facebook, the biggest sellers of advertising on the planet. They've got huge amounts of reach across their platforms. The kind of stats from Google would suggest that there's 1 billion monthly active search users across Google. There's 1.8 billion active users of YouTube. In the Facebook ecosystem, there's about 2.8 billion active users. These guys are collecting an unbelievable amount of data each and every day. And it's hyper niche and relevant to the individual user. It's based on literally everything that you might do online, the connections you have, the actions you take on your browser or in-app, and who you interact with, and also things that you do off-app, because increasingly these brands can basically see through their data partnerships what you're doing on the rest of the open web. And they're using this data to their own competitive advantage. The chart on the right-hand side shows the growth of digital advertising spend through time. And there was a very important tipping point that happened in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic, where over half of all ad spend became digital in 2020. And half of that half is Google and Facebook. And not only is digital rising kind of faster than the market, but Google and Facebook are rising faster than digital. So basically, Google and Facebook, powered by huge amounts of data, are now taking the majority of total advertising spend. And I think perhaps some of the data that they're gathering is a little bit self-serving, might be overclaiming effect. Now, anyone that's ever used Google and Facebook has probably used their kind of platforms that have been designed to help marketers manage those campaigns to manage that campaign. And you've probably seen an attribution report. You've probably used the word attribution when you speak to your colleagues and stakeholders on most days. Now, I think that probably the word attribution in our industry, in our world, in our environment is horrendously misused. If we look at the dictionary definition of attribution, which I put on screen here, it says the word caused as part of the description. It says the action of regarding something as being caused by a person or thing. So if we're going to use the word attribution accurately, we need to be reflecting causal factors behind why people buy, not the things that Google and Facebook call attribution. That's a very misuse of language. I think probably the reality of performance marketing measurement looks a little bit like this graphic here. When you advertise to a group of people in digital, you've basically got three types of behavior that you measure. You've got a bunch of people that don't take action, that basically don't respond to your advertising. We tend to kind of ignore those people and move on. The people I'm most interested in is the kind of the nuance between the people that do respond, because you've got some people that respond because of the ad. We've kind of indicated them with the kind of the red shirt in this graphic. And some people that responded regardless of the ad. They just happened to see or click on the ad, but then they took action. We've marked those kind of people in the graphic with a gray icon. My kind of personal lived experience suggests that actually the kind of ratios are the other way around, and that normally in a lot of advertising campaigns, particularly digital campaigns for big brands, the majority of people that took action did so despite the ad, not because of the ad. I'll evidence that later on in today's presentation. We need to kind of think about how digital attribution models work to understand kind of why this is happening and what we can do about it. In a kind of one-slide summary, and perhaps some of you kind of know this, so I won't labour this point. Essentially how these models work is that the digital attribution model looks at everything that the user has clicked or seen on prior to the conversion. So the graphic here suggests that maybe someone has seen a display ad, then a social ad, then clicked on a paid search ad, then converted. What the digital attribution model does is it carves up credit between those touch points and gives some of the conversion credit to each of those touch points. How much credit depends on the model that's being used. The last click model, unsurprisingly, gives all the credit to paid search in this example. But a lot of marketers think, well, I know that last click is kind of wrong, but I'm going to do a kind of multi-touch model to kind of solve that problem. I would argue that that's just a sticking plaster over this problem, because the kind of logic that exists on this diagram is true for kind of all digital campaigns, and there's a huge digital measurement bias. You know, we're only looking at digital touch points, and probably the biggest misunderstanding is that we're somehow saying that all of the touch points are somehow, you know, contributing to the end conversion. So I don't know about you guys, I certainly see and click on a lot of stuff that has no influence over my shopping behavior, but I suspect in the boardroom, people don't see it that way. And I would say that probably all digital measurement suffers what I call the pizza flyer problem. So if you're going to forgive me for just one moment, I'm going to tell a very little story, a quick story about a guy that opens a pizza shop, and he employs some teenagers to do some traditional leaflet marketing. He gives 3 teenagers a leaflet with a unique code so he can understand which teenager is driving the sale and give that person some commission. And he sends these teenagers off across town to distribute flyers, and he sees what happens. In a week's time, he notices that one of the 3 teenagers is like a marketing genius. He's responsible for like literally every sale for people coming into the pizza shop. Everyone that walks in is holding a flyer from this one teenager. And the owner's like, well, my God, I need to interview this teenager. It's like, this guy's a genius. Maybe he can train other people how to do marketing. So he asks the teenager, what's the secret? How do you do it? Like, what's the thing you're doing to drive all of these sales? And the teenager sort of shrugs his shoulder and goes, well, I just stand outside and hand out leaflets to people in the queue. So in that example, we're looking at kind of correlation over causation in people generating the sale. And I would argue that a lot of digital marketing works in this same way. Now, algorithms obviously work in a way that you're trying to find people that are going to buy. So inadvertently, our buying algorithms are finding people in the kind of queues to our digital businesses, in the queues for our websites. Now, obviously, there is no queue for a website unless it's like the Glastonbury tickets going sale or something like that. in a kind of metaphorical way, there sort of is a queue behind everyone's website. We give off signals that suggest we're about to visit, a bit like being in a queue. The things that you search for, the things that you browse, the kind of interactions you have with your friends and your family, all could be used by an algorithm to kind of work out, is this person about to kind of walk into my shop? Should I be giving this person basically a leaflet? And this is a big kind of multi-billion-dollar problem that us in the digital and performance marketing space need to wrestle with, one over correlation versus causation. Obviously, as marketers, we should only really care about when the teenager or our buying algorithms bring someone new into the shop, not just kind of taking credit for pre-existing behavior. I think probably a lot of this problem comes down to kind of measurement bias. And the reality of the situation is that all forms of media drive all forms of response. So what I mean by that is online media drives on and offline behavior, and offline media drives on and offline behavior. But in the world of digital marketing, we care about kind of one of these user journeys, the very easy to measure user journey, where online media leads to online sale. And that kind of preconceived idea of how you do digital marketing and the measurement around it, I think is the problem for a lot of the things I'm talking about today. What happens is that we kind of overestimate the importance of that online to online journey, and we assume that every journey that falls into that path is somehow caused by the stimulus we're giving, the advertising. And the kind of flip side to that coin is we ignore all of the hard to measure journeys. So when offline media is generating sales, we just sort of don't bother to measure that, it's too hard. When you have kind of cross media journeys, we don't bother to measure that either. And that leads to kind of marketers delivering kind of what I call a suboptimal media mix, whereby we're only kind of fixating on the kind of easy to measure journeys to the detriment of our total sales. And anyone that's kind of worked in the digital space for a number of time has kind of probably got to a fairly strong understanding of what works, but kind of what works is driven by measurement bias that I was just speaking of. When you hear that a brand wants to drive sales, the temptation for someone planning a performance mix often is, well, I'm going to build a plan that generates like high ROI or low CPA, and the kind of things that appear on the screen tend to kind of feature quite heavily on the plan. They tend to be brand search in search. In display and social, we do a lot of retargeting, and affiliate marketing is classically kind of associated with generating low-cost sales. But I would argue these tactics often kind of exploit measurement bias and kind of a misunderstanding of customer journeys. Because what happens in the real world, and I'll talk you through some examples of this in a moment, is that we've got navigational use of search engines, so people are just using it to navigate from A to B. We've got banner blindness, we don't remember the ads that we see, and you've got an affiliate, you've got people looking for deals, so kind of, maybe it's the deal that's converting them rather than media touch point. And so I'm going to talk through some of those examples at pace now. In search, I've basically captured some of my own searching over the last week. I searched for Tesco online delivery and Disney Plus. I bought Disney Plus this week, actually. In both of these examples, I noticed a paid ad at the top of the page, which probably looks like the best investment that these brands have, ahead of an organic link that costs nothing when the user clicks on it, whereas the paid ad, it does cost. And brands don't kind of understand the kind of very obvious synergies happening in their search space when, the more clicks you drive at the top of the page with a paid ad, the less clicks you're getting below it. And yet still to this day, brands persist on doing this tactic, even though it's very hard to drive incremental sales when there's no one else on the search results. You're just placing an ad in front of an organic listing. eBay famously released a case study about 8 years ago saying that, we switched off our paid advertising on the keyword eBay and nothing happened in terms of our overall sales. All that happened is that they just switched the number of clicks they were getting from the paid link into the organic link. They got just the same amount of clicks, they got just the same amount of sales, and they saved millions of dollars worth of advertising. It baffles me that 8 years later that more brands aren't aware of this and don't practice this kind of this finding. In display and social, heat mapping, so kind of like using eyeball tracking software, shows that, when we browse the internet, so unsurprisingly, we tend to look at the content that's on the page rather than the advertising. And these heat maps show that, very little attention is given to the advertising on these pages in both kind of the open web and in social. And yet we often don't kind of pay attention to this reality when we're assigning credit to the ads that appear on the page with very little attention. More research from the world of eye tracking comes from a company called Lumen, who kind of do lab testing, and they say that on average, only 17% of ad views are for more than a second, which is very, very low, but kind of feels quite real and quite normal. And another bit of research says that only 14% of internet users can remember the last ad that they saw. That to me actually feels like an overestimation, because I work in this space. It's kind of in my interest to pay attention, and yet like I can't remember any of the ads I saw today, and yet I probably saw hundreds of them. And yet we're regularly giving credit to these kind of ads that simply aren't remembered. And I think there's a kind of a fallacy that display in social drives direct response, because in my experience, it can be effective, but it's not really in a direct response way. The IAB would say that the average click-through rate for an ad is 0.05%. But there's also research that suggests that about half of all clicks, maybe 60% on mobile, are accidental. Okay, like that's a pretty low click-through rate. And if half of them are accidental, we can kind of do some sort of back of a fag packet maths to kind of work out what the real click-through rate is. It's about 5,000 to 1. Anyone that is a football fan and remembers Leicester City's unprecedented winning of the Premier League 5 years ago, I think now, that was described as a once-in-a-lifetime moment. 5,000 to 1 odds. That's the same chances as you deliberately clicking on the next banner ad that you see. And yet we're kind of optimizing our millions of pounds worth of media for these kind of once-in-a-lifetime moments. It's kind of a fallacy that it drives direct response. It can drive direct response, but it's very rare that it does. And what often happens in digital is that you give off a bias signal that maybe you're going to do the action that the advertiser wants, and then you get bombarded with advertising, because that's a good way of claiming that your media is driving sales. Another kind of bit of personal shopping that I did in the last week is that I applied for a mortgage. I don't know if you can guess which mortgage provider I applied for a mortgage with, because the DSP that is serving the advertising definitely knew which mortgage provider I was going to apply with. I visited HSBC's website, and guess what? They show me a lot of adverts. The screen grab you can see here, it's from a little website I like using called Who Is Retargeting Me? But in a data-driven attribution model, this display ad is probably claiming at least 99% of the sales credit for me as being these ads. I would say, well, no, they just had the cheapest APR rate available to me at that moment in time. I kind of converted despite the ad rather than because of the ad. And yet, the marketers might be doing more of these advertising because it looks like it works. And in affiliates, Martin Lewis is probably the most influential speaker and kind of commentator on how consumers should use affiliate marketing. And he literally says, I've kind of highlighted the text here, find the brand that you want to buy from and then click on the cashback link, because then you get it for a discount. And that kind of reality is just so different from my experience of working in kind of boardrooms and working out how to kind of optimize your media mix, where your temptation is to do more of the things that are driving sales. And quite often the things that are driving sales are, we're just creating an artificial discount on the thing that we're trying to sell. That then captures a lot of traffic and ultimately sales, so you end up doing more of it. And this is a kind of problem that Pizza Express actually fell into about 15, 20 years ago, where if you want to buy a pizza from Pizza Express in the early noughties, you'd probably have done it with a 50% discount, but never unless there was a 50% discount. That's the same issue that I'm talking about here now. So a lot of the kind of realities of kind of what drives performance is not actually the media, it's some other kind of reason, some other kind of quite normal reason for a consumer. Often it's just the cheapest way of buying. And we as marketers need to kind of navigate these nuances, which I don't think we're necessarily doing a very good job of right now. And how I kind of think about digital data is that very often, we have an abundance of data, particularly kind of from digital campaigns. And the way I think you make the best decisions from it is to take the data with a pinch of salt. You take it indicatively, not literally. You try and use the data kind of to create a picture of kind of what's going on in the consumer's world. You're not ignoring the data, but you're also not kind of following it blindly. And I think what that helps you do is kind of to understand, more what it's like to be your end consumer. And I'll give you a moment just to look at the kind of the playful graphic I put on screen here. So I think this is kind of often what happens when, in many campaigns, people buy despite advertising. Maybe they're just buying it because that's the thing that they want, and yet they're seeing all these different ads. Yes, the data that we get from campaigns is useful and can help us kind of make better decisions. But if you follow it blindly, you can become a slave to the data, and you fall into kind of some of the pitfalls that kind of Adidas, P&G, etc. are falling into. So yeah, take the data with a pinch of salt, take it indicatively, don't just follow the best ROI numbers blindly. And I think probably the most important thing that we need to think about when kind of determining whether a thing is working or not from digital data is user context. And I'm going to tell a very quick story here again now about how the word triage came to be. And it came from the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon found that his soldiers were dying on the battlefield. And he kind of realized that the best way to treat people on the battlefield is to get his doctors to triage and work out, well, there's three groups of people. There's some people that are sadly going to die regardless. Let them be. We can't do anything for those people. Some people that are going to live regardless. Don't have your doctors working on those people, but have your doctors work on the third group of people, which is people where medicine might make a difference. And I think as marketers, we need to take a big clue from kind of Napoleon and how he treated in-field casualties. In marketing, we need to think about audiences that we'll target in a similar sort of way. There's some people that are not going to buy from us. Let's not target those people. There's some people that will buy from us. Let's not target those people either, even though they'll give off very attractive KPIs and measures of success. We need to double down our marketing efforts on the people where marketing might make a difference. You'll drive a lot more effective results, a lot more kind of incremental gains if you target that audience. It's essentially what happens in politics, where, you know, in a general election, political parties will try and speak to swing voters rather than their heartland. That's what we need to do as marketers. And yet the abundance of data in digital performance marketing mean that very often we target that third group. We do preaching to the converted and pat ourselves on the back and say we're doing a great job. We limit ourselves in growth in the same way as the brands I've talked about right at the beginning of my presentation. So that's kind of what I describe as the pitfalls of digital measurement. I'm now going to move on to effectiveness research. I'm going to talk quite a lot about Binet and Field, the godfathers of marketing effectiveness research, and what they've got to say about what truly works in advertising, because we could probably take some clues from that in the digital space. So Binet and Field, for anyone that's not familiar with them, they wrote a paper called The Long and the Short of It, which is probably the most respected paper in advertising effectiveness that's ever existed. It's a kind of meta study, so a study of studies, where they look at every paper that's ever been submitted to the IPA Effectiveness Awards globally and try to work out the common features of what makes an effective campaign and an effective brand. I'm going to cover a couple of high-level learnings that they shared. The first thing to talk about is that historically, advertising works. So John Wannamaker's view about kind of advertising works, I just don't know which half. That advertising work statement is true. Binet and Field very famously observed that share of voice drives share of market. What that means is if you outspend your competitors, you'll get more of the market. So good, advertising works, but we can probably get a bit more granular than that. And this is probably the most famous chart that comes from these two authors. It's a chart that suggests that marketers need to balance both long and short-term marketing campaigns. Long-term campaigns are brand building, and short-term are kind of sales-driving campaigns. The graphic suggests that if you only do sales-driving campaigns, you'll get a spike of sales every time you kind of activate with maybe a discount, a promotional offer, or just kind of a campaign, pushing a promotion. You'll get a spike in sales when you do that, but it'll kind of peak and then trough, and you'll never really grow your business by just going out with sales-driving messages. How you grow your business is by combining sales-driving messages with brand building, because basically the more people that know and like you as a brand means that there'll be more people that can respond to you positively when you have kind of a sales-driving message. So balance is absolutely key, and I think that's one of the big things I've learned in my career as well. And I think it's very interesting that same authors point to the fact that over the last sort of 14 years, effectiveness at an aggregate level has been falling. It peaked in 2008 and has been falling ever since. They last updated this graphic in 2018, but I've seen nothing to make me think this trend hasn't continued on the downward trend. So it's kind of interesting when digital and measurable advertising has been very buoyant. We've never had more budget spent on digital marketing than literally right now. Effectiveness is falling. Something's going on here. Maybe we're using the wrong data to activate our media. And the authors talk about the reason for this is, well, short-termism is like the flip of that. While effectiveness is falling, short-termism is rising. And this is, how I became interested in effectiveness rather than performance marketing. I was like, shit, I think I'm part of the problem. Me kind of peddling digital metrics and digital media. This is part of the problem. We call it performance marketing, but it's harming performance. Another famous graphic from the same authors says that, if we understand that both brand building and sales activation are needed, Actually, one of those two factors is more powerful than the other. They would argue that long-term brand building tends to have the bigger economic benefit to brands, as in, the ROI of long-term brand building is higher than short-term sales activation. That's not to say that you shouldn't do any of the short-term stuff. Everyone needs, to pay their bills today, and everyone's got sales targets to hit today. And I would sometimes say you need to survive today in order to thrive for tomorrow. But let's all recognize, particularly us that kind of control performance budgets, which are inherently short-term, that pound for pound, generally the budgets are better spent in kind of long-term brand building, and our performance marketing will work harder when it's activated in a brand that people know and like and trust. They can go on to talk about that the optimal businesses tend to kind of split their budgets in a 60-40 way, whereby long-term brand building gets 60% of the budget and short-term DR and performance gets 40% of the budget. That's a very broad brushstroke, and every business is different. So the ratio for you and your brand is also likely to be different. But as an overall kind of observation, 64 is kind of true for the average business. And every business needs to kind of have a balance. It might just be 70-30 or 80-20. The kind of difference between long-term brand building and short-term sales activation is that, brand building influences future sales by reaching every potential buyer in your market, in your category. You kind of prime people emotionally to kind of be warm to your advertising when they see a sales message in the future. I'm sure you guys probably all very familiar with what sales activation is. It's basically short-term, highly targeted. It's about sales today. It's basically performance marketing along with some traditional direct response in the offline world. And to make things kind of confusing, because most of us exist in organizations that have kind of a brand department and a performance department, or maybe a department for each and every kind of channel tactic that exists. Now, every media channel delivers both long and short-term effects. So, what they're saying here is that DRTV and inserts, they're pretty direct response, but they still influence the brand. And sponsorship is very brand leaning, but it still drives sales. But I'm quite conscious of the fact that when you sit in a performance team or a brand team, you kind of get given one set of KPIs. If you're in a performance team, you're optimizing towards one variable, which is sales. And if you kind of sit in a brand team, you care about your awareness and your consideration. But if everything drives all of those things, like this kind of distinction about having these two teams and a different set of metrics feels very kind of false. And I think one of the problems we've got is that the media that drives both brand and response, the stuff that sits somewhere in the middle of this diagram, it kind of gets underestimated from either one of those brand or response measures. It's doing always something for the other metric. And unless you measure both at the same time and kind of have an estimate for what these things are doing for you both at the same time, you'll always underestimate what media is doing for you. I think this is actually one of the problems that kind of programmatic and social has fallen into. We think it's direct response as marketers, so we measure it like it's direct response, but actually a lot of the value it gives is more towards brand building and differentiation. And I think the final slide we've got in terms of the effectiveness research doesn't come from Binet and Field this time. It comes from a lady called Grace Kite, who is very active on Marketing Week. She's an econometrician, which we'll talk about in a moment. And her research suggests that not only is there a split between brand and performance for an effective marketer, there's also a split between on and offline. She suggests that the most effective businesses spend about 40 to 50% of their budget online. That's not the same split as the brand performance split. Another bit of research suggests that when you spend on multiple platforms, so for example, Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, YouTube, the more platforms that you advertise on, the higher the ROI of your campaigns. My take on these two graphics says that kind of complexity is important for driving growth. I realize as a kind of measurement person that actually it makes things a whole lot harder to measure. If your media mix is like in lots of different places, it's very hard to understand what's driving your results and what's not driving your results. So we need to kind of follow this guidance about how to be effective, but we kind of need to recognize that it makes the idea of measuring this stuff a whole lot harder, and perhaps it's often a trade-off that you should be willing to make. Now I'm going to move on to how you'll measure for incrementality. I'd like to talk about getting out of the measurement trap, and this is another graphic from one of my favorite illustrators, Tom Fishburne, the Marketoonist. I'll give you just a split second to read the cartoon. The cartoon's kind of playfully making fun of what happens in a lot of boardrooms, certainly a lot of boardrooms that I've sat in, whereby you've got quite long-winded and complicated customer journeys where, perhaps lots of different touch points are needed to warm someone up to ultimately convert. But, the final link in the chain gets seen and recognized and measured. And then, like all of the spend suddenly moves to that final touch point. What I'm about to talk you through is kind of how we can get out of this and how you can kind of see the reality of the customer and not just that final interaction. I think probably the most important thing to think about is that there is no kind of objective truth about what drives sales. And we need to be thinking about uplift. Now, uplift recognizes the user context. And uplift is a really important thing to kind of get your head around, because when you measure lift, you get very different results from kind of last click or any kind of digital measure that's kind of readily available at the press of a button. When you measure lift, you're understanding that different audiences have different kind of predispositions to do the action that you want. And when you measure for lift, it kind of unlocks a lot of the media mix, because you'll find that you can create lift from lots of different audiences, not just people that are highly likely to buy. In digital campaigns, we tend to do things like brand PPC, as we've talked about, and retargeting, a bit like my HSBC example. Those are very often seen as activities that drive a low CPA or high ROI. But they only do that because they're speaking to people that basically are about to buy from the brand. They're speaking to a very warm set of users. But when we measure lift, you'll understand that you can drive lift from doing cold prospecting and display and social, and from kind of longer tail keywords in search. The difference is that when you're not counting a load of existing sales that are going to happen anyway, the low propensity users don't look like they're giving very good metrics when measured kind of on last click or any metric like that. But when you measure lift, you'll realize that actually all of the tactics I've shown on this screen kind of are quite viable techniques for driving performance. You just need the right measure of success that kind of recognizes the contribution of all of these different things that speak to users at different stages of the buy cycle. Sounds complicated, I know. And there are basically two ways of doing that. One is a controlled experiment where essentially you've got, a bit like a placebo in medicine. You take two groups of people, give advertising to one and not the other group of people, and measure the difference in outcomes. That's a way of understanding incrementality and the lift generated by advertising. And the other method comes from using kind of big data. You might hear it called marketing mix modeling or econometrics. Essentially, that's a grand way of saying, well, we do a lot of regression analysis on marketing data, not just digital data, but it can be all forms of marketing data from on and offline media, as well as some of your kind of marketing numbers like, pricing and promotions and distribution. All of these things can be quantified, and, the things that kind of regularly correlate with your sales outcomes will infer that that's a causal factor in driving sales. That sounds pretty complicated, I know. I'm going to talk this through in the next few slides, but I would say both of these techniques are very powerful and are best used in combination together. What I mean by that is that if you take one measure of success individually and bring it to your CFO and say, right, I've measured my advertising, the ROI is X or Y or Z, probably your financial stakeholders will take that number with a huge pinch of salt, because it's kind of a number that's been given at a moment in time without much context, and probably it's quite a different number from other numbers that they've seen and heard reported by you or your predecessors, or what they've seen in other kind of walks of life in marketing. How I think about it is that if you can kind of get your different measurement systems, they're all ultimately trying to work out what drove the sale. You can kind of start to harmonize them through time as you kind of have ongoing kind of exposure to what they're doing. So what I mean by that is that you might run some econometrics or MMM, and then you do some digital attribution modeling that kind of gives you a very different answer. And then you can run an experiment that gives you another different answer again. The kind of learnings from each of those, these things that you've done, can improve the accuracy of future rounds of it. So learnings from an experiment might improve the logic of your digital attribution model. You might do things and go, well, retargeting, we can't claim all of the sales here, or because of the ad, because of, some of these people are going to buy anyway. You'll be able to understand that by using these measures of success in combination and making kind of logical improvements over time. And the way we think about this at CVE is that each step in this kind of journey gets you ever closer to true ROI, gets you ever closer to kind of bringing something to your financial stakeholders that is 100% accurate. I'm now going to finally kind of close my final section here is some learnings from incremental measurement. So some of the things that hopefully you can take away from this session here today. with what we've learned from doing this stuff over the last sort of 10 or so years. Big learning for me is that digital attribution and econometrics give very different interpretations of ROI or what drove the sale. But that's okay. A digital view would say that, well, each and every online conversion is driven by digital media touchpoint. So every kind of click on a website comes from search or an ad or an affiliate link or something is driving those sales. I would say that's just the kind of navigation. It's just the kind of the digital user journey that got someone on the site. That's kind of useful, but it's not the truth in its own right. You get to see the truth by doing the big data analysis that I talked about from kind of MMM and econometrics. And the graphic on the right-hand side is an extract of a big brand I'm sure you guys would have heard of. I probably can't tell you for confidentiality reasons, but the kind of an MMM view of what drove the sale. And an MMM view of what drove the sale includes like 20 or 30 different factors. It ranges from payday to bad weather, to the strength of the economy, to the coronavirus. These are all reasons why sales do and sometimes don't happen. Those two things, when used in combination, are actually really powerful because, on the right-hand side, it's looking at the causal factors behind why sales happen. On the left-hand side, we're seeing like much richer, much more abundant data that can be given to you like on a daily and an hourly level. Combining those two things together is more powerful than the sum of their individual parts. So it's okay to put into different results. That doesn't mean that one of them is wrong. And probably the biggest epiphany I ever had when it came to measurement came from actually looking at this chart here. This chart is an extract from 7 econometric models that I've personally worked on for big businesses that, again, I'm sure every one of you on the call would know and probably have purchased from. And we've broken down for these 7 large businesses, all of which that sell online, what are the drivers of sales according to big data? And there's 4 drivers that we kind of broke this down into. You've got acquisition media, which is in the black, no more than about 10% of sales for any of these businesses. You've got brand advertising, which can be pretty big. One of these businesses is about 20% of their sales. And you've got price, which is important as a big reason why people buy, which can range from 5 to 20% as well. But the thing that really draws my eye is the blue line. The blue line is what we call base. Base is basically what would have happened without us advertising. So if you remember the graphic I showed early on and the user going, I don't know, I bought from them because they were out of what I normally buy. Base can normally explain most sales. Most sales are not driven by advertising. If you think about a digital business, every sale is tracked and claimed by advertising. And I think that what happens in performance marketing is then the pitfalls I spoke about right at the beginning of today's presentation is we're looking at data that's happening for people that are having base sales, for sales that aren't really caused by advertising, but us as marketers, we kind of act and claim that they are. And we're optimizing it so everyone that buys gets seen an ad, they click on it or they see one. We think the advertising is working. Really what we're doing is just taking credit for behavior that's always likely to happen. And occasionally maybe driving the odd incremental sale, but those kind of needle in the haystack, unfortunately. I think it's very interesting, the difference between a incremental sale and a digitally attributed sale. I worked with a big 6 energy brand that were adamant that they had like the best attribution model that money could buy. And you know what? They were kind of right. They did have the best attribution model that money could buy. It was a data-driven attribution model that came from Rakuten, very, very good attribution model. It's still fundamentally wrong because it's worked on the logic of, well, what's the user seen in like the last 30 days? I'm going to give credit to that, but they'll do it with an algorithm. To kind of emphasize this point, I ran a load of controlled experiments for each of the kind of media channels we are running for this big 6 energy brand. And we compared the CPA according to the DDA model versus the incremental measure. And what you're looking at is the outcomes of this. The difference is jaw-dropping. What really kind of caused controversy is the brand PPC point, where the Rakuten data would suggest invest in this very heavily. For every £20 you spend, you get a sale. The incremental numbers suggest, well, you actually need to spend £400 to drive an incremental sale, which is not cost effective. And retargeting as well was a thing that this brand was spending a lot of money on when they were only looking at the DDA data. The DDA data suggested that you had to spend £100 on retargeting, you'd get an extra sale. That's not true. In incremental terms, they need to spend £2,000 on remarketing to drive an incremental sale. So maybe like 3 sales a month, not many sales. And having this kind of new learning about what's working and what's not working really invigorated their media mix. It allowed them to have their best ever year. And I think they were probably the only Big Six energy brand that had a good year that year, because Big Six energy brands were kind of toxic at this moment in time. The graphic here is I'm quite pleased with this because it was one of my case studies. It shows that in 2017, this particular brand, the one I was talking about on the previous slide, they had 78% more sales than any other previous year. And that's quite rare in energy. Energy is not particularly known for kind of coming in and out of fashion quickly. Normally kind of +2% is a good sales result for these sort of brands. So to get almost double year on year is pretty staggering. And really this was completely enabled by measurement, by measuring incrementality more accurately than the data-driven attribution model, more accurately than the kind of leading technology would suggest. And final bit, I think, in terms of the kind of learnings from incrementality, I was so pleased to see that more academics are turning to this space and are studying the phenomenons I'm kind of talking about here as well. An academic called Gordon, who kind of works in a university, his surname is Gordon, rather his first name, he did a kind of study that looked at 13 different brands and the sales that they were generating from Facebook. And he was like, well, I want to see how many of these sales were caused by Facebook advertising and how many of them were merely claimed by Facebook advertising. The summary is on this bar chart, whereby the blue line is kind of the total of that's claimed by advertising, not necessarily caused, and the kind of turquoisey green line is what's actually caused by advertising. In summary, there's much more of it that's not caused by advertising than is. And my kind of personal little build on that would be that if you work for a big famous brand, probably there's a lot more claim going on, because big famous brands have a lot of active buyers for them. If you imagine someone like Amazon, if we were going to do performance marketing for Amazon, you don't have to target many people to find someone that's going to buy. If I looked out my window right now, there's actually kind of someone delivering Amazon packages, and about half of my street are getting a package right now. It's very easy to claim that your advertising is working when you kind of deliver advertising for Amazon. But big brands have something similar going on. The buyers of HSBC, the buyers of Disney Plus, things I bought recently this week, pretty easy to predict. Pretty easy for Facebook to claim that their advertising is working just by showing ads based on strong buyer signals. And the Facebook kind of default attribution window is 7 days for click and 1 day for view. What that means is that they'll take credit for advertising when someone has seen an ad, whether they've seen it or not. Seen in Facebook's definition is, I've dropped kind of a cookie on you. They've seen advertising and go, I could claim business, even for Amazon, just via the kind of measurement methodology. If they show an ad to everyone, then sale online is caused by Google are the biggest walled garden. They've got unless you kind of work with their measurement platforms. And that's really, really dangerous, because you have to rely on Google and Facebook's version of the truth. You have to rely on some of the data bias that I've talked about here today to kind of understand what's going on for your business. And probably the most egregious facet in all of this is that, I talk about running incremental lift. That's a way you can understand what's going on a lot better. Studies, themselves, they just haven't been caught maybe yet for kind of cooking the books on their data. Right, I'm almost at the end and we're almost out of time. Thank you for listening to me for a full hour. Hope you've not got too bored of my own voice. CVE is here to help you. I realise this is quite a complicated and detailed world, and a lot of this is kind of based on trust as well. We're quite mindful that this is an area that marketers need to trust their partners with, and we've designed our products and services to help marketers navigate the many pitfalls that exist within measurement and much data bias that exists within measurement as well. We've got products around incremental lift measurement and consultancy. We've got effectiveness products that help you kind of understand the true contribution of advertising, help you set KPIs, do A/B testing, work out the best time of year to advertise, and even do kind of new and emerging techniques like share of search, which comes from that same stable of Binet and Fields. We would love to work with you and your brand and kind of hear more about kind of where you are with your measurement journey, what pitfalls you've maybe encountered, where you want to go next. I'm kind of conscious that I've spoken a lot today and you're probably eager to kind of have a little break from talking about measurement. So one of the things we'll do after this call is we're going to send out the slides as you'd expect, along with a little survey that hopefully you'll fill in that will help us kind of understand who you are and kind of what we can do to potentially help. And I would love it if we can arrange a follow-up session for us to talk in a bit more detail about you and your business and what measurement can do for you. And I think on that note, I am done. Thank you for listening. Just with 2 minutes to spare, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them, but I am conscious that we said it'd last an hour and you've only got 2 minutes.
Thanks for that, Aidan. Really interesting stuff. Yeah, there's a couple of questions, but I'll definitely follow up with the survey. But yeah, thanks again for that.
Thank you, Aidan. Pleasure.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for that, Aidan. It was good.
Thanks very much, Paul. Always appreciate your comments on LinkedIn as well.
Cheers.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Aidan.
Take care.